Welcome to the working world. I'm Jamie Lingham.
And I'm Keryn Mendez. Today, most successful organisations recognise agility in the critical success factors to thrive in an ever-changing and increasing volatile business environment, such as what we're going through right now with COVID-19. Businesses are having to adjust their strategies more frequently and align their organisations accordingly. Global talent sourcing is today an essential part of the organisational strategy. HR and mobility professionals are expected to play their part by injecting resilience and efficiency into their mobility policies, processes, and service delivery models. In this session, we explore the benefits and challenges, limitations of a global employment company, or GEC, and how we can use this to future-proof our mobility programs.
On this episode, we are honoured and privileged to have Mario Ferraro from ITX as our guest. Mario is internationally recognised as a thought leader in the area of global mobility and international HR. Besides spending time in Europe, he's also spent the past 21 years in Singapore working in international mobility, where he's acquired vast expertise and experience with Mercer and the Big Four. Mario is a big deal. He officiates regularly as key speakers during major international mobility events, and he's also been published several times and presented in different media globally. And on top of it all, he teaches both at local universities in the APAC regional and international campuses, as well as being an expert on GECs. Mario, welcome to the show.
Hi, Mario.
Thank you very much. Great to be here. Hello, Keryn. Hello, Jamie.
How are you today?
Very well, thank you. Great.
Good. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Mario, I wanted to jump straight in and hear from you in relation to your view of the roles of GECs in relation to, I guess, the rise of the virtual workforce or the COVID workforce virtual assignments.
Sure. Well, let's say, first of all, we noticed, meaning as GEC professionals, we noticed that those organizations with the GEC, generally speaking, were able to react more coherently, more rapidly to the COVID-19 emergency. Let's say that many mobility professionals were caught by surprise, they were left confused. And, in times of crisis, it's very important to receive a lot of information from the outside, coordinate it, but also to make a lot of decisions from the inside. And having that single point of coordination, having that single point of accountability where all the information flows into, but also all the decisions internally are actually passed on to in order to then be executed rapidly. I think that central point of accountability and coordination really helped organizations to respond in a very cohesive way to the crisis. As opposed to organizations where each individual mobility professional in different countries had to make those decisions and coordinate with their respective businesses. So I think that helped a lot. Clearly, one of the side effects of this global pandemic has been the acceleration of this phenomenon of virtual assignment or remote employment. And again, that is an area that is fraught with complexities, with risks. Initially, organizations were just improvising, thinking that it was a temporary situation. But as time goes on, we realize that actually, you cannot keep the status quo without asking yourself questions about compliance, questions about costs, questions about, how do we make this a sustainable model? And again, this is something that you cannot leave up to each individual country or market or team. It needs to be coordinated internally because it has some direct impact on the ability of the business to operate. It can have implications in terms of risk exposure, but also talent retention. And so again, having the GEC that actually acts also as a center of expertise, but also as a single point of interface for the business and for the broader HR team. That, generally speaking, that really helped the organizations to come up with a cohesive strategy to the crisis.
Mario, as you said, I mean, the mobility world was rocked by COVID, and I think it's like a 9.8 on the Richter scale. I think for a lot of us, it was really severe. But obviously, it sounds like from what you're doing and what other GECs are doing, it's really brought you to the fore. And there's other companies out there who are starting to realise, hang on a second, we need to do something. How long do you think it took organisations to realise that what they were dealing with, and as you said, they're not going to go back to where they were. How long did it take them to start calling you and actually say, hey, we need some help outside of what we have at our own four walls?
Yeah, I will say it's happening slowly, to be honest, because the GECs are still kind of a bit of a secret and a bit of a mystery to many organizations. They are often either unknown or poorly understood. And so it has been our job at ITX to actually educate to a great extent, not only the mobility community, but also the business community who ultimately needs to buy into the idea, into the concept of a GEC, to make them realize that GECs are actually extremely versatile structures that can be used not only in an emergency such as COVID, but on an ongoing basis. They give you the opportunity to achieve huge economies of scale, cost savings, better compliance, better visibility of what's happening to your mobility programs, precisely by virtue of the fact that you have a single point of coordination, single point of accountability, managing all the information, all the data, managing the relationship with your vendors. And so everything becomes much easier to manage, to coordinate, and you have much clearer visibility of what's happening on your mobility programs. So it is happening slowly, but let's say that this crisis has been a bit of a catalyst because it has provided ITX with a receptive audience, an audience that is hungry for new ideas, looking for new solutions. And I think, without wanting to take advantage of the situation, we are actually simply demonstrating how a global employment company can address not every single problem. I mean, it's not really the, the silver bullet, but it can address many of those problems. And most importantly, it gives you the simplicity of being able to quickly decide and execute, which in times of crisis, that ability to quickly come up with well-informed decisions and then an impeccable execution in a time of crisis that is of critical importance.
Mario, I know you and I have spoken before a little bit around some of the foreign legislation changes that need to or have adapted to the new global ways of working. And I guess trying to do that at the same speed as the actual pandemic is quite challenging. But I understand from speaking to colleagues and yourself that, there are some thoughts around moves towards protectionism for many countries when it comes to the immigration programs. And so I wanted to understand from you and through the GEC lens, what you're seeing on your side of the fence, so to speak, in relation to this and what we could perhaps expect in relation to this shift.
Yeah, it's interesting because let's say even before the pandemic, we were already seeing a gradual shift to a more nationalistic and protectionist attitude in many countries. But clearly with the pandemic has brought a lot of suffering to businesses. It has created unemployment. And it has actually shut the borders for many reasons, for safety reasons. And so now we are facing a situation where many countries are actually having to protect their own nationals and try to stimulate the economy. And so I think going forward, we will continue to see some changes, some more difficulties in business travels because companies have lower budgets, but also because there will be barriers, additional checks, and so on. But also on a bigger scale, we are likely to continue to see tighter immigration rules. Now that raises an interesting point with regards to virtual assignees or remote workers. You see, a foreigner, before a foreigner is allowed to work in a country, typically he or she will have to go through an immigration process that will determine that this person is not really taking away the job of a local employee, right? But what happens if that same individual, bypassing completely the immigration rules, will actually perform their job remotely? He or she may still be doing a role of someone who could be doing locally. But again, bypassing the immigration, not paying any taxes in the country.
Exactly. How do you regulate
Social
that, right?
security and so on. So I think,
Yeah.
let's say that the legislation is today, in my opinion, lagging behind what's happening on the talent management front. But I believe it's just a matter of time before, you know, if this trend becomes more prevalent, and I believe it will, it's just a matter of time before some governments will start to impose some legislation regarding, you know, the impact that virtual assignments could have, perhaps on the local labor market, but also in terms of, you know, performing work that benefits an organization overseas, and raising some questions regarding taxation. Let's say that in terms of corporate tax, there is already this concept of permanent establishment, which means if I'm doing performing a role here that benefits an entity in another location, it is possible that the contribution that I make to the business will be taxed in the foreign location in terms of corporate tax. So some of this legislation already exists, but it is very likely that we will see a tightening of other taxation and possibly immigration rules as well in response to what's happening.
You know, it's absolutely mind-blowing to me, because I mean, if you look at ways that companies have been working with things like Airtasker and remote working, obviously the market drives the work, you know. So yeah. Are you saying that you think that there might be certain friendly countries who will start to set up treaties among each other? And then I suppose to take it a step further, how will we deal with the countries who don't want to buy into or enter into these treaties? Because it sort of seems there's going to be a 2 or 3 speed system. Right. To me, it's mind-blowing.
Well, I totally agree. And it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out, because again, in every crisis, there is also an opportunity. In fact, if you look at the Chinese word for crisis, it consists of 2 symbols. One is risk and the other one is opportunity. They've already figured it out a long time ago.
Yeah.
But you see, it really depends on how the business environment evolves, and connected to that, how the talent landscape will evolve. I will be very surprised if we were to go back to a very protectionistic, status where businesses will only operate domestically. I believe that businesses will continue to operate internationally, and in doing so, they will create demand for skills, talent in foreign markets. Now, that may well put governments in this dilemma. Okay, do we want to just change, do we want to just tax these organizations, or do we actually want to import knowledge with a view to developing our own talent, transferring skills, so that we can be competitive as a country, because we can provide the talent that global organizations need, and they come and invest in these countries. This is what's been happening with Singapore, for example, for many years. One of the reasons why Singapore has been attracting so much foreign investment has been because it has allowed foreign talent to come in, and that's created an ecosystem that is very conducive to setting up regional or global headquarters in this country. And so I think there is going to be a bit of a competition. As you say, Jamie, it is possible that some countries will go the other way and become investment friendly, and they will take this long-term approach. And in doing so, they will become more competitive in terms of attracting foreign direct investment compared to countries that are really more protectionistic and more focused on collecting tax revenue.
It's really fascinating, Mario. When it comes to, I guess, supporting organizations around navigating these changes and foreseeing these changes coming, what do the GECs bring to the table as far as supporting that possible remote workforce establishment, either short-term or long-term, and are there differences between, those potential models?
Yeah, I think in the short term, again, the Global Employment Company could help to alleviate some of the complexities and some of the challenges. You see, remote work, it's relatively, from an operational point of view, is relatively straightforward if the employee is working from a country where the company has a local subsidiary. The easiest way to do that is to employ that employee within the local subsidiary, providing services, providing support to other parts of the organization. But one of the challenges is where, you may have repatriated someone who used to be on assignment, expecting him or her to continue virtually to perform the same role, but they are repatriating to a country where you do not have a presence. The question then becomes, who is the employer in that country? That brings up the issue of employer of record. And you may have a number of complexities, different compliance requirements, intercompany billings, potential permanent establishment issues, and so on. Now, the Global Employment Company helps to simplify all that, again, by creating a single employing entity, employing these virtual assignee populations, managing the compliance through a single point of interface with vendors, such as employer of record service providers, tax consultants, immigration consultants, and so on. And also giving you that visibility of who are these virtual employees. In addition, since the Global Employment Company would employ such virtual assignees, if one day this virtual assignment becomes a real assignment, so if someone relocates physically, they will continue to be employed by the same structure. So there will be full continuity of employment history, and so on. And the other advantage is very often if you have this population of virtual assignees, you may have, in some cases, problems with benefit coverage. If I have a single employee employed, in a country or perhaps a very small population, I may not have the economies of scale to justify some of the benefit plans like retirement or pension, medical, and so on. But if I aggregate that headcount into a single employment structure, that gives me the economies of scale to actually start designing various plans, including incentive plans or even stock options and so on. So the Global Employment Company, again, it gives you can design it in any way you want. I mean, you can give it any functionality you want, and you can this is what we do effectively. We work with the clients to understand what are the objectives, what is the specific situation of each organization, and then design a Global Employment Company so that it delivers value, but also it addresses the critical issues that the company is trying to address. So it is an extremely versatile concept, which can be designed to your needs.
I think though some organisations right now are struggling with displaced employees more so than probably focusing on their more permanent populations. Right. And so, how have you seen GECs step up and support in what would seemingly be perhaps a short-term solution as opposed to a longer-term engagement?
Yeah, mainly in an advisory capacity. Many organizations nowadays are still at the stage where they are trying to understand the compliance obligations. How long can we keep these employees in a country? What do we do with respect to immigration? Are they approaching the tax threshold? The 183 days. Many of them have already gone above, and deciding, how do we react? So let's say that so far there is a lot of reactive activity. My personal opinion is, I look at the COVID-19 crisis as an example of a variety of crises that we may face in the future as well. So for me, this is not only about addressing the COVID-19 crisis. This is about injecting that organizational agility and resilience that will allow the organization to continue to operate effectively even in the future, beyond COVID, because, today is COVID, maybe in a few years' time, it could be a natural disaster. It could be a terrorist attack that disables the infrastructure. It could be anything, all right? So this is why we should take this opportunity of this crisis to ask ourselves some questions, okay? If we had known earlier, what would we have done? How would we organize ourselves? Knowing very well that, this is a big crisis, no doubt about it. But unless we extract some lessons from this crisis and use those lessons to develop a more agile, resilient, flexible structure and operating model, then I think we are missing an opportunity there.
Great.
One thing that COVID's really taught us is that there are, you can survive with remote workers, and I think not only survive but also thrive. And if you look at the Spanish flu, I think it lasted for 3 years. And so everyone talks in 2020, I can't wait to see the back of it. But the reality is 2021 is coming. Right. I can't see travel happening the way it used to. My understanding is we're going to go down from 800 airline companies globally down to 100. So obviously the availability of flights is going to be reduced. Do you think that companies will get used to this type of arrangements and saying, okay, well, I've done it for a year, or I've done it for 6 months, and start to actually leave people in a number of countries or in their home countries and still operating with GECs more? Or do you see this as a temporary sort of transition?
It's difficult to tell. I mean, my prediction is that clearly, as you say, we have learned and we have tested how much can be done remotely and virtually. And therefore, that will be taken into account in the future whenever there is an operational need. You know, I think it is very likely that companies will continue to ask themselves, you know, can this work, can this job be done remotely? And the reason why I hesitate slightly is because, you know, this question of whether technology will ultimately enable us to do away with global mobility. This is a question that, you know, I heard like 30 years ago when I started in mobility. And in reality, technology has been precisely what has helped the world to become global. You know, what has connected businesses and people around the world, that has driven globalization, which then led to a constant increase in the number of assignments. So technology has actually been one of the drivers of the enablers of globalization and the globalization of talent as well. So I think, you know, we will continue to see, you know, after the crisis, once it's over, slowly, we'll continue to see physical moves. However, I do think that virtual assignments will become part of the policy portfolios of many organizations. So in the same way as, you know, many years ago, we could only choose between a long-term, short-term, or permanent transfer. And nowadays we have a much broader portfolio of options, you know, including commuters, developmental assignments, you know, staff rotation, whatever. You know, I think virtual will be probably one of those options. And again, how prominent will it be? It also depends on how the legislation evolves around these assignment types, which will drive the cost and how easy it's going to be to implement them.
In a way, it feels like you could probably grow your business faster. Yeah. And actually, I mean, you don't have to have the physical real estate. Sure. If you're going to grow your office in your home country. Yeah. So you won't need your physical real estate. You can still grow the business. You can still have access to people in a number of countries. Yeah. Yeah. And sort of work around the clock, couldn't you? I think, you know, if you adopt this model, there's a second way to think of it. Like you said, yeah. If there's crisis and opportunity, what's the crisis and what's the opportunity, instead of renting a bigger building, you know, and if COVID hits again, well, that lease is obviously, exactly. You know, sort of thrown away. Yeah.
And I think at the strategic level, I think there is another important trend that is underlying all this. You know, there are many studies, and I've participated in some of these studies, that point to the fact that the work, the jobs, so organizations are moving slightly or gradually away from the concept of a job and much more on the concept of skills, meaning that, you know, it is not what box are you in an organizational structure, is what skills do you bring to the organization. And because things change so fast, you know, the pace of change has been accelerating. The skills that are required to execute an operational strategy change all the time. They are very quickly, they can be very high demand, and then within a few years they're obsolete and the company is looking for something else. And so organizational strategies have a very short shelf life nowadays. Now, what that means in terms of mobility is that those skills that you do have may be quite rare, may be quite scarce, and you may have to deploy those skills in different parts of the world because, you know, you cannot duplicate them or replicate them easily in many parts of the world. You may have a talent pool with critical skills, and your job is to actually make sure that those skills are deployed to various parts of the world, wherever they are required. Now, mobility then becomes core, you know, a critical part of the organizational strategy, of the execution, and unless you're able to move those skills to the locations where you need them, you may lose that competitive advantage. Now, question is, can that be done virtually? If you're able to do that virtually, you have a huge competitive advantage because you can achieve that without having to invest in infrastructure, travel costs, real estate, and so on, right? And in some cases, it may be possible. In some other cases, it may not. But I think that, in my opinion, this strategic way of thinking about mobility, to go back to, you know, how does it really help the business to survive, thrive, and compete?
Yeah, great.
And then I guess we get into the territory around blurring the lines of talent ownership then, and, you know, retaining that talent and giving that talent direction. And we're talking about, you know, working remotely and spreading your skills across the globe. But I mean, I guess whether you're engaged with a GEC or whether you're doing that in-house, you know, are you seeing that this potentially could be challenging the traditional hierarchical structures of organizations?
Yeah, I think definitely it has an impact on the culture of the organization. The mere existence of a global employment company sends a clear signal to the fact that there is this concept of global talent management. There is a global talent pool. And so the big question in many organizations is who owns your talent? You know, is it owned by the geography? Is it owned by the business unit, by a specific manager? And that leads sometimes to a certain political dimension when it comes to moving people and using those skills for the benefit of other organizations. By creating a global talent pool supported by a global employment company, you start moving a lot closer to this concept of global talent management. And managing a global talent pool. And it also sends out a clear message regarding how valuable is that international experience for the organization. You know, organizations with global employment companies tend to recognize the value of international experience. And sometimes they make them a prerequisite for career development, for moving into leadership teams, right? So clearly, as you say, it kind of dilutes a little bit that culture of ownership of specific talent and creates more of a culture where talent is an asset for the organization to be deployed in whichever way benefits the entire organization.
So just to that point, I suppose if, you know, the way it sort of seems to be shifting, do you think that it will be a employee-driven model? So mobility will move to employee-driven as opposed to employer?
Right. I think the answer there is really on the supply and demand. Okay, if you are an employee with unique skills that are in high demand, you're probably going to call the shots there. All right. Yeah. But as those skills become kind of fairly common and then eventually obsolete, then perhaps, you know, you're going to be desperate for someone to give you something to do, and that's usually the case. All right. So so it's possible. I mean, let's say that putting aside the current pandemic, you know, we are going through a phase, if we take a broader perspective, where there is a shortage of talent, even in locations where there is high unemployment. Surprisingly, when you ask the C-level people, what is your biggest problem? You know, one of the top 5 or 10 issues that they bring up, we cannot find the right people. And that's because that, you know, 10, 20, 30% of unemployed people, they're not just unemployed, they are unemployable, unfortunately. They haven't been able to update their skills. They have skills that are perhaps irrelevant to today's business environment. And so that kind of underlies the dynamics of you know, who is in control. But generally speaking, because the technology environment, the business environment, the strategies, even the social political situations are changing so rapidly. It is generally speaking, there is a high shortage of qualified talent, and most organizations will recognize that issue. That means that when you find someone who has exactly what you're looking for, then you probably need to ensure that the employee is well taken care of, because, you know, it's for the benefit of the organization. So the employees, if they have the right profile, they will have quite a bit of clout, I think, in the discussion.
Yep.
Sure. And then that leads to the question about whether they're willing, assuming they physically can and the borders allow them to, whether they're willing to relocate for a role. Precisely. And if they're not, then you need to get into the conversations around, can you support their employment in their country? And so I guess that leads me to my next thought around GECs, I guess, supply a mechanism to overcome a challenge like that, and give organisations who don't have presences in countries the infrastructure they need to engage someone locally. But how do GECs ensure that, you know, the culture of an organisation is fed back into that person? Admittedly, the GEC is the employer of that person, but I can imagine many organizations want to make sure that there's that follow through and that follow through in relation to culture and engagement back to headquarters. So how do GECs tackle that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because I think that we need to distinguish also, right now we are going down to the next level of detail. We need to distinguish between the concept of a GEC and a professional employer organization.
Mm-hmm.
So strictly speaking, the GEC will be a fully owned subsidiary of the organization. So it will just be another branch, another subsidiary that employs your individuals. And so the individual stays within the organization. There is no loss of employment relationship with the organization, and the employees are deployed to other subsidiaries. Now, as you correctly say, it is possible that sometimes the organization may need to employ or deploy someone in a country or to a country where there is no legal presence, in which case the global employment company can contract with an external, with a third party, which is called an employer of record or a professional employer organization. Now, that would be effectively the scenario that you described, where the employee is effectively employed by a third party. But very often those arrangements can be totally transparent. Apart from the employment contract that is required locally for legal reasons, the organization can determine the compensation, a lot of the benefits, and clearly there will be some statutory benefits that the employee needs to comply with due to the legislation in the of a specific country. But that will be the case even if they were deployed to one of your subsidiaries, right? Mm-hmm. The same employment law applies. The same statutory requirements will apply whether you are in one of your subsidiaries or employed by, through a third party. So in essence, I think it's more of a psychological barrier than anything else. I think the onus, however, is on the employer to ensure that this employee, although employed by a third party, feels part of the organization, is connected to the organization. And so it is very useful to invest a bit of time in coaching not only the employee but also the managers to ensure that that situation actually becomes as transparent as possible.
So I suppose pre-COVID, what were the trends that you were seeing emerging with organisations who are working with GEC? What changed when COVID hit, and what trends are you seeing at the moment, or what we see coming out of COVID?
Right. Okay. So just to give you a very brief history of GECs, I mean, GECs have been around for quite a few years. I mean, ITX has been the pioneer in that field, and we've been around for 20 years. So historically, global employment companies were seen with some level of skepticism, mainly because they used to be based in these Caribbean tax havens, which now are attracting a lot of scrutiny. For example, we do not advise that, in fact, all of our global employment companies that we set up and manage for our clients are in very transparent jurisdictions such as Switzerland, Singapore, UK, Ireland, and so on. So that is important. But just to give you an idea, there were many companies embracing the concept of GEC mainly for tax planning purposes. But then the focus shifted as the tax loopholes were closed. The focus shifted more onto the organizational efficiencies, the ability to coordinate quickly and effectively, the deployment of employees, the single point of accountability, the reporting, the visibility, and so on. And I think that led to a growth of the utilization of global employment companies. So we have clients who have all of their expats in a global employment company. But also we have clients who actually set up a global employment company only for their top 3 employees. So they have a legal entity to employ 3 people. Those happen to be their top executives, and the client doesn't want any particular HR team to actually manage them. They want a third party, namely ITX, to manage them, right? And so there are different reasons for that. So we have seen a diversification of the users of global employment companies. Then when COVID hit, clearly the biggest impact was a reduction in the headcount, simply because all these expats were repatriated. Some of them got stuck somewhere, but effectively the number of assignments went down. That's where we are today. But now we are at the stage where organizations are asking us, how can I leverage this structure to continue to operate through a combination of physical deployment and virtual assignments? And so they are realizing how versatile and how useful this structure can be to help you to restart your mobility programs using the flexibility of leveraging the same structure for both virtual and non-virtual assignees. So I think going forward, we will see that as the global employment companies become better understood and their potential becomes more evident, we're going to see much greater adoption of such structures. And just to give you another example, as you know, we've gone through quite a few years ago a whole phase of localization, where companies were so focused on localizing employees, stripping them of all their, expat benefits, in many cases for good reasons. And now you have employees who are deployed to, countries like, Thailand, Vietnam, or some other countries in Latin America, on a local or local plus package, which may be okay. But sometimes the concern is, look, I don't mind paying Social Security in Vietnam, being paid in Vietnamese dong, whatever, but you know what? I may have a bit of a concern with my retirement because I'm not planning to retire here. I'm not going to get much out of these Social Security payments. So what do? Now, if you have a global employment company that gives you the scale to create say an international pension plan, there is nothing preventing you from saying, look, you set the rules, right? So you can allow participation of such an employee and to benefit from some kind of a supplementary retirement benefit, something to top up whatever he's going to get from the local Social Security, if anything, right? And so again, leveraging the same structure and extracting as much value as you can out of it to support different types of assignees, whether it's traditional, virtual, senior executives who are usually employed on a local basis. They're not even moving physically. Locally hired foreigners, you can use it in many, many ways. So that gives you that flexibility that ultimately benefits the organization.
For companies who have never dealt with GECs and who have been sort of pushed out of the nest and forced to adopt this as part of their strategy moving forward. Obviously, ITX is been around the longest and one of the biggest, but if they're looking, what three characteristics would you be looking for in your GEC if you are actually starting to look at the market and having to work with organizations such as yours?
Yeah, I think what's important, in my opinion, is really to articulate the business case and to understand precisely, what is the problem you're trying to solve. As I mentioned, there could be many reasons why you may need or you may want a global employment company. It could be administrative efficiency. It could be a focus on compliance. It could be costs. It could be a lot of different things, even assignee experience, or maybe you want to move towards this global talent management model. So understanding what are the underlying drivers is essential, because that will be the basis for, first of all, the feasibility study, right? I wouldn't recommend anyone to jump into a GEC and then keep their fingers crossed that it works. You do a feasibility study, understanding what you're trying to achieve, and then you kind of simulate it through a feasibility study, and you establish that actually we can do it and we are going to get what we want to get out of this. Then you move on to the setup and then eventual management, which you can do, you can manage it directly or you can outsource to us. So actually, there is no one else to whom you can outsource a GEC at the moment. Right. But so that's really the first step. And clearly, in the process of doing that, depending on your objectives, then you need to decide the design parameters. What would be the best location where you could set up this GEC, and then you look at what is the tax regime, what is the employment law in this country, what's the availability of talent. All this kind of, are there social security agreements between this country and other parts of the world? Because if eventually, the employment contract will be transferred to the global employment company. And so, for example, many of our clients have benefited from having a global employment company in Switzerland, for example, because Switzerland has many social security agreements with many countries. And so an employee who perhaps was moving, I don't know, from say Singapore to the United States, normally they will not benefit from any social security agreement because there is no such an agreement between Singapore and the US. But the moment this person becomes an employee of a Swiss company, right? Effectively, that will be an intercompany deployment, like an intercompany transfer between a Swiss subsidiary and a US subsidiary. that may help this person to qualify for Social Security benefits, which then eventually we will find a way of recovering when this person eventually leaves the organization or leaves that global employment company and goes back to re-employment in the Singapore structure. These are just examples of, you know, some of the things that you need to consider. But the starting point is really clarity as to what are the underlying drivers, what are you trying to achieve.
And also, I'd probably add to that as well around what the individual, the employee or the expat wants to achieve out of it as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. And there is always this underlying need to think about the career planning of the employees.
Yeah.
And you know, my theory is that if you want to use mobility to transfer skills across the organization, you need to work not just on the mobility plan, but also on the career plan, because unless this expat knows that there is the next career move ready for him or her, there is going to be a lot of reluctance to pass on their knowledge to someone else, because they are going to make themselves redundant by doing so.
Exactly.
You know, but if you say, look, you know, if you transfer your skills, you develop your successor, because the moment you do that, you are released to be, you know, to be considered for a bigger role or for a different role or for another assignment, then there is a bit of an incentive.
Yeah.
And so again, we need to look beyond just the mobility and the tactical approach of doing a job. We need to go beyond that and look at the knowledge transfer, so the sustainable long-term solution, but not just for the company, but also what are the long-term implications for the assignee.
Couldn't agree more. Well said, Mario.
Look, I love that intention, because I think that has to be the driver through everything that people do and organisations to do, and having them to pause and to think about it. We've had some really great learnings from you today, Mario. I think that, you know, obviously looking at the way it now seems that GECs are not going to be an either or proposition. You could actually have a mix of both. I think that if people won't or can't travel, I think there's a definite advantage there. We've covered off the growth of organisations using overseas foreign nationals with different skill sets. It sounds like that, you know, post-COVID, it's going to be a new world. I don't think that we're going to bring everything pre-COVID into the post-COVID environment. But, you know, I think it's been really great. It's been super informative. You know, I'd like to thank you personally for coming in and sharing your insights.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
Thank you, Mario, for your time. We really appreciate it.
You're most welcome. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, Mario.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.